He was ready to fight the 2018 provincial election as the leader of Ontario's Progressive Conservative Party. Then allegations surfaced that derailed Patrick Brown's leadership and his hopes of becoming premier. He strongly denied the accusations then and has now published his side of the story. The book is called Takedown: The Attempted Political Assassination of Patrick Brown. He was elected mayor of Brampton in October, and he joins us now. Hi.
Well, great to be back on TVO.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. And this is my first time interviewing you, and there's a reason for that. Before we start, in the interest of transparency, for those wondering why Steve is not doing this interview, it is because his wife has worked with and come to be good friends with Mr. Brown. And so we didn't want even the appearance of any conflict, and that's why we're talking. But I'm excited to be able to interview you.
Likewise.
It's not too much to say that 2018 was a defining year for you. At the beginning of the year, you were the leader of the PC party. And before the end of the year, you had been elected mayor of Brampton. How would you describe 2018?
Well, it was a tumultuous year, to say the least. But, you know, I think everything happens for a reason. And as much as I wouldn't wish what happened earlier in the year on my worst enemy, it ended up being a beautiful year. You know, I took the time to value what is really important to me. Family is something that I cherish. I do one day want to have my own family, and I took the time to really focus on that. I got engaged. I got married.
Congratulations.
I've got a wonderful partner in Genevieve, and I was just so excited about that. And I never thought I'd be back in public service so quickly, but having the trust of the people of Brampton to serve as their mayor, you know, I love the task before me. And so if you asked me how 2018 was going on January 25th, I would probably have been pretty pessimistic. But, you know, I end the year pretty positive.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the book, because in the book, you write about Genevieve. You were actually dating her when you were leader of the party, but it was kept a secret. Why was that?
There's a lot of attention on the leader of a party, and I signed up for that attention. I signed up for that scrutiny that comes with the attention. She certainly didn't. And when you're starting a relationship, I think out of fairness, you know, you shouldn't put that on your partner. But I think, frankly, I should have highlighted my love sooner.
But wasn't it also because, like, people who were around you said that she was much younger? I think the difference is 16 years.
Yeah, and so there were some people that offered opinions, some of my core strategists saying, you know, wait a little bit longer. And there was those in the party who were saying she's incredible, go out there and flaunt her. And there was those that that were more conservative in their advice. But, you know, in fairness, there was people like Carolyn Maroney who had these Genevieve works at Sick Kids Foundation. You know, Carolyn's had some encounters with her and told me, you know, she's fabulous. You know, you should have her by your side at events. And so there was, you know, there was a variety of opinions. And frankly, even that in itself is unusual. The fact you have so many people offering opinions on your relationship is.
But you are the leader of the party, so I guess optics are everything, right?
I know, but even that is unusual. And the fact that Genevieve and myself have a normal life right now in Brampton is absolutely sensational.
Maybe something you didn't think of January 25th.
No.
Let's get into the book.
Yeah.
You write about who was behind it, who you think was behind your takedown, and you write in the book, in my mind, it was clear that the takedown had been engineered by the Liberals. They may have had help from the stakeholders who stood to lose from my being premier. But either alone or with these other stakeholders, they teed everything up. My party just finished the job. What role did your party play in your takedown?
To be quite candid, I think I was an alien in the conservative movement. You know,
you felt like an outsider?
Well, I was really taking the party faster than they were prepared to go. And let me expand on that. I was the first progressive conservative leader to take official delegations in the Toronto Pride Parade and the Ottawa Pride Parade. When we had that PC banner at the Pride Parade with the leader holding it, it was controversial. There was members that were irate. I felt it was the right thing because love is love is love, and it's none of government's business to be telling you who you love. But I took very strong positions on that. I frankly, on sex education, the same thing. You know, some of my party members had gone out far in a by-election saying that we wouldn't support the updated sex education curriculum, and I overruled them. And I wrote a personal note saying that I believe combating homophobia is important. I reined in my party on issues of gay rights, and in my gut I knew I was right, but I realized that I was going faster than the party was prepared. On the issue of Islamophobia, I was the only conservative leader in the country that supported the Liberal motion condemning Islamophobia. And the same thing, what faith you have, what God you worship, it's none of government's business. And on the issue of climate change, that may have been the most controversial within the party. To have a conservative leader supporting the federal government's National Climate Change Accord to support carbon pricing was unpopular in the conservative movement.
Well, some of the people in your party, especially the people on the right, they feel betrayed by you. Their argument is that you ran as a conservative PC for the leadership, but once you won, you morphed into a progressive PC. Do they have a point?
Well, I feel they didn't do their due diligence. I was the first MP in Barrie's history to attend a Pride flag raising. If they had have done their research and looked at that front page of the former Barrie
But as an
Examiner.
MP, you voted to open the debate about gay marriage.
Well, that was a commitment of the former government of Prime Minister Harper, and that was a platform commitment he made. And so you can do your research based on the government you're in, but I think a better indication of the research is the positions you take as an MP in your own riding.
Well, that brings me to another question, because in the book, you kind of take us into what politics is like.
Which is unusual in a book,
It
right?
is very unusual, but like you just said, people who were in your caucus, when you talk about the carbon pricing, they agreed with you. But now, because it's a new government, they have a new leader, all of a sudden, things that they really believed in under your leadership, it seems like maybe they didn't believe in it. So as the public,
can I tell you an astonishing thing?
Well, let me just ask you the question. So do politicians actually believe in these issues, or do they follow the leader?
So probably the worst kept secret in the world, but within the political process, the reality is there's caucus solidarity, and they follow the will of the leader. And it's very unusual that you have members step out of line when the leader, clearly sets a position in stone. And so I'm not surprised that, Doug Ford has taken some very strong positions on these issues. And if a caucus member took a different position publicly, well, I don't imagine they'd last very long in that caucus. A good example of that more recently is Amanda Simard on the
Francophone issue.
On the Francophone issue. And so I imagine that there are members of the caucus who a year ago were strong believers in gay rights and condemning hate no matter what religion you adhere to. I imagine there are members of the cabinet who believe in the importance of climate change, but ultimately they're being team players. And in caucus, and in caucus and in cabinet, the way the partisan system works is there's an expectation that you're going to, especially in government, especially when it's actually the cabinet that the premier appoints, that you're going to follow his or her wishes.
I think that's a disheartening thing to hear if you're a member of the public.
Well, absolutely, and it's one of my criticisms of the political process is I think we should give more autonomy to members of parliament, members of provincial parliament. One of the things I write about in this book is I was actually a big fan of the work that Michael Chong did. You may not know, but Michael Chong was an MP, still is, of the Wellington, Halton Hills area, and he put forward a proposal to Parliament called the Reform Act, and the intention was to take away the leader's powers over MPs. Right now, a leader can unilaterally kick out an MP or an MPP out of caucus. A leader can unilaterally choose not to sign the nomination papers. So an MP's future is in the hands of the leader of the day. And what Michael Chong was trying to do was to democratize that. And frankly, it's long overdue in Canada. And the best contrast, look at the United States. You could have someone like John McCain, who was challenging his own party. In Canada, that wouldn't be tolerated. And that's not right. I think healthy debate, a healthy democracy means that you can have debates not within the political system, but also within the political party.
Let's take it back to the book, because we could talk about that all day. One thing that struck me about this book in the Takedown, or the so-called alleged Takedown, is that why were you so disliked by your own party that they were willing to risk chaos just a few months before the election?
I think the lead we had in the polls was so significant that many felt the only change would happen internally. At the point that I was taken down, we were up by 20 points in the polls, and so that is almost. There's nothing guaranteed in politics, but it's almost insurmountable.
But it's still a risk. Because it seemed. Why were you so disliked then?
But if you look at, let me give you an example. There's a website called Rebel, which is a right-wing. Hard right website that I think is the voice for some of the hard right in the conservative movement, and they were just as critical of my positions as they were of the liberal leader. Their articles were saying I had sold out conservative values. They were calling me a liberal in conservative clothing, and so I was growing the party, but some of the older members were not happy with how the party was evolving as it grew. When I took over the PC party, it was when I first announced my intention to run for the leadership, there were 10,000 party members. It wasn't diverse. It was largely rooted in rural Ontario. By the time I was removed as leader, the number was either 15 times or 20 times that, depending what numbers you believe. We were at a record membership either way, and it was the most diverse it had ever been. And when the party grows, it's more rooted to Ontario. And what I felt, as much as some people felt like they were losing their party, I thought we were better rooted to Ontario.
Well, at one point in the book, you call them the good old boys when you're referring to the PC caucus. When somebody hears that, it kind of has sounds of the South. What are you trying to say by calling them the good old boys?
I certainly think there was an old boys club in the party. I was never expected to win the party leadership in the first place. The first poll that came out in 2014, I was at 2%. The front runner was at 71%, and the margin of error was 3%. The fact that this unknown backbencher could come out of nowhere, signing up record numbers of memberships, some of the people that had run the party historically felt their party had been taken from them. And so I thought we were taking the party in a different direction. Some people thought that I was stealing their party from them. I thought we were actually taking the party back to their roots. I really believed what I was repositioning the party as was a real progressive conservative party in the likes of a Bill Davis, that we could be passionate conservatives, but at the same time care about the environment, care about building an inclusive society. It was Bill Davis that created the Ministry of the Environment. It was Brian Mulroney that negotiated the Acid Rain Treaty. This notion that conservatives can't care about the environment, this notion that conservatives can't be the most inclusive party, the fact that the conservatives can't care about things like labor rights. I just felt that the Conservative Party had gone down a path that was creating a smaller and smaller tent. And my goal was to radically change that.
But it seemed like you misread the room, because you say you tried to make the party a more progressive one, but the province ultimately gave Doug Ford's version of the party a majority.
Well,
were you wrong about what the voters wanted?
Well, no, I would take issue with that.
Why?
When I was leader of the party, we were up by 20 points in the polls. 20 points in the polls. There was certainly an appetite for change. The voters had decided they wanted to get rid of Kathleen Wynne. The fact
Would you have won a bigger majority, do you think?
If you believe the polls, it would have been substantially larger. If you believe the polls, the final result was, I think, 14 points less than where we were in January. And so that's a dramatic decline. The voters wanted change, but to say that it was an absolute adoption of Doug Ford's policies, I think, is incorrect. I think what the voters clearly said is that we wanted to remove Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals from office. And sometimes governments do this. Sometimes, and this is not just in Ontario, sometimes governments mistake their victory as a mandate for what they were campaigning on, and forget the fact that sometimes it's their victory is as much about the voters wanting to get rid of the current government. And I think in the case of Ontario, that's absolutely the case.
So you're saying anyone, it didn't matter who was the leader of the PC party, they would have been elected?
No, I'm not saying that. Anything can happen, and frankly, but what I was saying is that I think a moderate conservative vision would have had a much larger victory.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. What does your alleged takedown mean for those moderates and progressives in the PC party?
So I'm sure there's a lot of moderate progressive conservatives that are worried about the direction of their party. Having said that, there's some really good people in the government that I think can be voices within that caucus for that moderate Bill Davis style of conservatism, and I hope that their voices are heard. There's a number of caucus members, cabinet ministers who I have great admiration for.
Well, let's get back to the book a bit. You name a lot of names. I actually had a running tally of Patrick Brown versus, you know, you detail a lot of private conversations, or, you know, isn't that a breach of privacy or implied privacy?
No, listen, people's personal secrets, any of the private stuff that I thought was innately personal, we didn't touch in the book. I was certainly not getting into anyone's relationships. So, what we focused on were examples of hypocrisy or examples of people that may have benefited from what happened. And so I think we were judicious in what should be included in the book and what shouldn't.
But aren't you worried that, because I'm sure a lot of politicking, like a lot of the work that you do have a lot of off-the-record conversations, or even just if someone was to read this book, you do name names, you call a few people out, a lot of people out. How do you gain people's trust now moving forward?
So I would say if you're going to be duplicitous, if you're going to be Machiavellian, then I'm not a person to work with, because I'll call you out on being duplicitous. I'll call you out on being Machiavellian. But if you want to be good, decent, hardworking people, then I'm a great person to work with. But frankly, I think all of us should do that. If someone is duplicitous, it should be exposed. There are bad characters in politics, and I think it's important that their behavior and their attitude not be swept under the carpet. If you want to have more faith in the political process, I think transparency is a good thing. I think the public has the right to know, and frankly, the fact that the culture in partisan politics is completely secret. The fact that the public has no idea what happens within a caucus meeting, the fact the public doesn't know what happens within a political party, how is that good for democracy?
But when you were leader, were you, did you have that position? Why didn't you call out certain politicians in your caucus when you were leader?
Well, actually, if you look in the book, I took on elements in my party in a way that was unusual. And if you get the copy of the book, it's on Amazon or Chapters or Costco. I talk about people that I specifically challenged in the party, and I think, and I feel that we took the right approach.
But you kept some things off the books. You mentioned Vic Fideli in the book. You also talk about Lisa McLeod, and you call her a mean, unpleasant person. And others have noted in the early reports on your book, you quoted people who wondered whether her mental health struggles were real. Is that an appropriate allegation to publish without any evidence? So
let me say, first of all, that when I was leader of the party, I put forward the largest investment in mental health in Canadian provincial history. It was in the People's Guarantee. And I talked about how I worked with Lisa McLeod on that commitment. What I also highlight is the fact that I had her back, despite the fact that she ran against me in the leadership. I disqualified her opponents. When she was on the verge of losing her nomination, I disqualified her nomination opponent, not once, but twice, two different opponents, despite the fact that the party's operation, the party officials, and some members of her own staff didn't want me to, because they felt that she wasn't being sincere on her struggles. Because I believe, and I say this in the book, you should always give the benefit of the doubt to someone who has the courage to come forward. And so what I felt to be particularly disappointing is, despite overruling my own party to show my support for her, that I was so disappointed that when I found out that she was party to the nastiness that came towards me earlier this year.
Well, you call her mean, and I wonder, Would you say the same about a male colleague? Would you call them mean?
I said a lot of
No,
things.
I read the book, and there's no other politician in there that you call mean.
No.
She's the only person you call mean.
Well, there's and I may have been quoting other people, but let me say there are a number of my male colleagues in the PC party that I would definitely characterize as mean.
Well, one of the other people that you spent a lot of time talking about was Ali Khan Val Shaw, your former chief of staff. This is what you wrote about his hiring. He really did give a great interview. I now believe that Val Shaw played us in that interview to get the job. And I often wonder if he was there all along to undermine me. Why would he have wanted to undermine you?
Well, when I say he gave a good interview, he was supporting the entirety of the direction we're taking the party. He had worked for Jason Kenney before. He had worked for Ethical Oil. He had worked for Ezra Levant, and we had had some association with him through Ethical Oil. And we had said, are you on the same page on our commitment to the National Climate Change Accord, that we have to do our part, that Ontario has to do its part? Are you on the same page on LGBTQ rights? Are you on the same page on Islamophobia? And all those issues, he said 100% what you're doing is growing the party's tent. And so he gave a very good interview.
Why didn't you call him out? Because I think, frankly, what does that say about your leadership if you can't notice that someone's playing you?
So it's one of my great regrets. I think my biggest mistake in provincial politics, and I talk about this in the book too. Once again, another reason to get a copy of the book. But one of the real lessons I had is the people that I had worked with over the years, they never left my side. The people that had worked with me when I was in federal politics during the leadership had never left my side. The people that abandoned me in that hour of that period of adversity were the mercenaries we brought in. There was a few members like Alican that we had heard great things of from Ottawa, that had worked on Prime Minister Harper's campaign, that had worked on provincial campaigns. The mercenaries we hired for the purpose of the provincial election, they're the ones that weren't loyal to my dream for Ontario. They weren't loyal to their boss. They were loyal to their paycheck. And so I think there's a real lesson to be learned that loyalty matters, and mercenaries are not people that you can rely on.
Well, in the book, you blame a lot of people for what happened. What responsibility do you take for what happened?
I take full responsibility for the people that I chose, those mercenaries that I signed off on hiring. That's entirely on me, and it's more than a valuable lesson that I have learned. It's something that I'm never going to forget. Obviously, it was the ramifications for myself were enormous.
Doug Ford, when this book came out, said that you shouldn't have released it once you became mayor of Brampton. Is he right? So,
I gave Doug Ford a heads up about the book as a courtesy. Listen, Doug Ford wasn't there when all this happened. He wasn't in provincial politics. But I think it will be good for Doug Ford to know about some of the people that he has down there. And if I was Doug Ford, I'd read the book because it's instructive on some of the actors down at Queen's Park that are frankly would not be people I'd have a lot of confidence in.
Well, I don't know if he has that much love for you, but recently he had a meeting of the mayors, and noticeably you were not invited. What do you make of that?
So I think it's in Doug Ford's self-interest to be good to the people of Brampton. And frankly, if you look at the modern Ontario and Canadian history, no one has become elected premier or prime minister without winning seats in Brampton. Doug Ford won seats in Brampton. He's got two of his valuable members of his team from Brampton. And if he wants to stay as premier, it's in his self-interest to honor the commitments that he made to the people of Brampton. And what I would say is, I don't care if it's Doug Ford, I don't care if it's Justin Trudeau. My party now is the people of Brampton, and whoever delivers for Brampton, I will praise. If Doug Ford helps us with our transit needs, our education needs, our healthcare needs, I'll be the first to praise Doug Ford. Even if I share a different philosophy of conservatism than Doug Ford, I'll be the first to praise him if he delivers for the people of Brampton. And I hope that he'll see that light and he will do good by the people of Brampton. An encouraging note I'll have to say is I've The Prime Minister of Canada has reached out, his office, on 2 occasions now, saying that they want to help us with some of our projects. And so where there's one obstacle, a new opportunity.
But we do have a federal election coming in October, so
appears, yeah.
What if the government does change? But we have like a minute left. After everything that's happened.
And I would say, on that note, both the leader of the official opposition and the Prime Minister federally have reached out, and so I'm impressed by both their interest. And so regardless if it changes, I think it's important that the City of Brampton has a constructive relationship with all our funding partners, both provincial, federal, and regional.
Now, as Mayor of Brampton, do you feel like you've been vindicated?
Well, yes, I think the voters, were very clear in saying they didn't believe any of the BS, and I'm so grateful for their trust and confidence. But I do believe that where this all started with CTV's negligence and airing false allegations, that ultimately I'm not going to feel a full vindication until that judicial process completes. As you know, there's a large defamation case that is currently before the courts, and when that's complete, I'll feel a sense of relief that it's been.
And CTV is defending their position, and they're
yeah.
standing by their reporting on what happened.
As they would in a court case, but ultimately, I feel confident that they'll be held responsible, and at that point, I'll feel a greater sense of vindication.
Patrick Brown, the mayor of Brampton, and the author of Takedown, the attempted political assassination of Patrick Brown. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.